with a couple of the ideas I was going to share today, having them a little bit in a couple of dot points I thought might just be helpful.
Do you want to turn the laptop so you can see?
I actually might do that if that's all right. Thank you. Fantastic. Well, guys, I'm going to jump straight into an idea that I'm going to kind of take as a little bit of a given, and I'm really, really mindful that there might be people here who wrestling with this idea, thinking about it, still not necessarily sure whether they agree with it, and that's completely okay. I really encourage continuing to wrestle with it. But I just want to a lot of the ideas that we're going to build on today start with this. And I wanted to make it clear that I think it comes through the lens of one of the greatest blessings we have in life is to be able to experience life with Jesus. It's definitely something that's been my experience, and I'm continuing to try and understand it more and more as a journey as well. But everything we build off will start with this. And I guess where I'm kind of going is that there's, I think, a really personal aspect to this with me and Jesus, you and Jesus, and what that can look like. But in particular, I want to spend a bit of time today talking about what this might look like for a group of people. Often we call them a church, we can call them maybe a community of believers, but how do we experience this as a group together? And there's this passage in the Bible that I think casts a pretty crazy vision of that in the book of John. And I'll invite you to join me in reading this little passage. We read there, and just to give context, that Jesus has just prayed for his 12 disciples. And as he concludes praying for them, he continues his prayer, which will pick up from where that transition happens. We read there, "My prayer is not for them alone," that's speaking of the disciples. "I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you have sent me and have loved them, even as you have loved me." I find this a slightly tricky passage because there's lots of references with hims and yous, which when there are capital letters, I find them very, very helpful. Just pointing to which one, who exactly is being referred to. But I want to maybe point out that Jesus is sending this really futuristic forecast from everyone from the time of his disciples who's changed by the message of Jesus' own life. He creates a picture that he hopes that they will get to experience. And I guess that tends to mean that we're included in this prayer, that even though it came from Jesus' lips 2,000 years ago, it applies just as much to us today as it did in, let's say, 35 AD. And we're included as the focus of Jesus' thoughts here. And he paints this picture of the kind of connection he hopes we'll have to himself and to each other. And there are three points that I just want to draw out or highlight from this passage of the kind of picture Jesus is painting. Three results of this type of connection to Jesus. One of them, he says that the world may believe that you have sent me. So this kind of relationship we have with each other and with God is meant to be a demonstration of the whole world that Jesus is more than just a person. He's more than just a human on earth, that he was sent from God himself and was God himself. So what's often termed as being a proof of Christ being divine comes out in this passage. A second one is that the people who believe in Jesus will be one with each other, even to the level of oneness that Jesus had with God himself. So there's this description of unity. And the third one, I think right near the end, is that the world will know not only that you have sent me, referring back to that idea of Christ being divine, but that it'll be a demonstration of God's love for us. And that demonstration isn't just for us to experience, but it's for the whole world to see as well. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this is the only way God ever reveals himself to humans. There's, I think, plenty of times where we may even have more accurate pictures of who God is from other sources. But Jesus does use this or describe this manner of revealing himself to an onlooking world. He hopes that his people or people following him will be able to represent his love very clearly. And I guess today I want to maybe put out the question to consider is, what's been your experience of that type of community? And I'm asking you to sort of reflect past, present, what would you like it to look like in the future? Does this type of a description feel like a high hope? Maybe like an uneasy non-reality? Is it relatable? Do you think you find yourself immersed in a culture like this? Or do you feel maybe that there's areas that it's still to be grasped as well? I think one of the hopes is that the communities that we're in that are following Jesus will be places that we can go to experience and be reminded of the awe that many people have seen when they look at the life of Jesus. To a place where we can experience the sort of tender-hearted care that is demonstrated so repeatedly, but then also a space to experience God's love when we really struggle to remember it in other areas of our life. If that's been your experience, then I really, really are grateful for that, and that's an incredible blessing. And I think for many of us who maybe feel there's potential still to be tapped into, I think there's a really awesome picture we can look at in the book of Acts in particular, where the early Christian church seemed to be functioning and relating to each other in such a way after the life of Jesus that lived up to this kind of a potential. They're often referred to outside of the Bible as like the early Christian church. So you might hear me throw that term around a little bit today. But I think from their example, there's a fair bit we can learn and reflect on. And in doing that, I hope you don't mind if I use a little bit of an odd question to help us glean a few valuable gems from their story. The question is, what would church look like if it were illegal? Now, bear with me on this one. This is not a question that I'm asking in terms of, well, let's go underground and do things secretive. It's also not a question that I particularly entertain in the context of maybe some people who wrestle with this sort of a theme around the end of the world and what would church look like then. I think the reason this question has a bit of value is because there are a lot of parts of the world where there seems to be an experience of communities of believers that have a lot of similarities with the early Christian church. And I'm particularly talking about places like North Korea and Iran, the places that do have a lot of persecution and where their faith can even cost them their lives. There's lots of reasons we could analyze and talk about why that happens. What kind of influence does persecution have on a community of believers? What sort of value do they put on the Bible in these parts of the world where it's an illegal document? But I think the reason I want to use this question today is because what being illegal tends to do is strip back a lot of things from communities, particularly things that have been traditions passed down without good reason, cultural influences that don't find a place in these communities, and they're often left or forced to focus on the things that are at the heart of following Jesus. So in some ways, I think this question can help us to unpack a little bit more of what are some of the characteristics of a community following Jesus where they prioritize the things they could never go without. mainly because the reality in North Korea is they don't have much bandwidth but to focus on those very things. The church in Iran doesn't have any choice but to focus on those priorities. And the church in the New Testament made it a priority to focus on these fundamentals of communities following Jesus. Maybe to ruffle the feathers a little bit, I hope you don't mind if I throw out maybe two very brief examples of what doesn't feature in these parts of the world where persecution is very prevalent for communities following Jesus, or in the New Testament. One of them is they don't seem to have a big focus on articulate presentations by a preacher. Now, I want to really make it clear, every community of believers has teachers. They're always learning and understanding, particularly from the Bible, all around the world. Yet it's a very different thing to have that and to make, compared with making a presentation from someone who pulls on the emotional heartstrings every week as the high point of the week. We could talk about the role of speakers and talks given from a pulpit in the early Christian church. While it does feature, I think we might find that there's a very different role to the role we've often given that nowadays. The other thing that doesn't feature at all in these parts of the world is a building either. It's pretty crazy that the words church have been completely synonymously used to describe both a building used for religious purposes as well as a community of believers. They've often become one and the same. And this is something we do not find at all in the book of Acts. The intention today isn't to knock the idea of having a building at all, but I think it's a very different thing to believe that the building forms a community following Jesus. Looking through the early Christian church, they met in homes. They had very few places where they could meet in public safely as well. And they seemed to be very, very well connected to Jesus. So sometimes I hear it come up in conversations that when churches are having difficulties, they often go to fixing, renovations, extensions as something that might help. And I think the Bible paints a really strong warning, thinking that material building ideas are going to fix church problems. The solution very commonly tends to be to draw nearer to Jesus. If you look at the church in North Korea, you look in Iran, they don't have buildings they meet in. So maybe that does warrant a little bit of a reflection that buildings cannot be the focal point, the essence of a community following Jesus. Now, I don't just want to leave you with ideas around what church or what a community of believers shouldn't focus on. I want to leave you with a couple of ideas that the book of Acts and New Testament make very, very clear. And the first one is the incredible role that prayer had in the lives of not only individuals but communities at this time. There's this passage from Acts 1:14, I'll just read out. These all continued in one accord in prayer and supplication with the women and Mary and mother of Jesus and with his disciples. This is a moment the book of Acts described just after Jesus had returned back to heaven. And we see a time of huge uncertainty for the followers of Jesus. They needed direction, they needed a guidance. And instead of asking God to bless their own plans, they spent time waiting in prayer for God to reveal his plans to them. I'm going to power through a couple of these ideas, but you will notice a theme as we read the very next chapter, where it says in Acts 2:42, and they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayers. This particular verse comes from after one of the more significant sermons that had ever been shared in the New Testament from Peter on the day of Pentecost, where 3,000 people came to join the community of believers. And we see from the very entry into that community, there was a big focus on prayer. They were living together, bringing needs, bringing thanks to God in prayer. And not only that, I'm going to jump to a few chapters later where we read in Acts 4, and when they had prayed, the place where they were assembled together was shaken, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit, and they spoke the word of God with boldness. This is actually a bit of a wild one, because Peter and John had just been to speak before the priest in the temple, and they'd got a big grilling and had escaped relatively unscathed to rejoin the community of believers. And here we see this incredible response where prayer was such a big part of any effort to share Jesus with other people. It was also a very natural response to celebrations. It wasn't just reserved for those times in a community where we were in dire straits. All the good moments of the community were brought to God in prayer. The last one on this theme I want to share with you is actually, did I skip Acts 6:4? I don't have this one here. It's a very, very short passage in Acts chapter 6, verse 4, where we read, "But we will give ourselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word." This is a time where the early Christian church was trying to do a little bit of a delegation process of how they would meet the needs of the community. And the people who were often considered at the head of this whole movement and giving guidance, the apostles of Jesus, they delegated some tasks, and this is the task they took ownership for. And the thing that really strikes me is that if you had to pick who would be the person I would just send off and get them to do the most important jobs, it probably would be the apostles. They knew Jesus the most closely. Yet they didn't see that as an automatic qualification. They recognized that there was a big dependence on God for the whole, for the opportunity to share God with others. So they took on themselves one of the primary responsibilities of prayer. And they asked that God would be with them in all of their outreach efforts to share Jesus with others. I think they recognize that we in ourselves have absolutely no power to save anyone. We have no power to share God in a way that touches the hearts of people. Only God can do that. And to be connected to Him in prayer allows us to be a part of the work that He's already doing. So I think we can see very, very clearly, I did have that verse up there, sorry, that the early Christian church was very, very, very much a praying church. They were so acutely aware of the task, of the opportunities to share Jesus ahead of them, that they were in tune with God through prayer. I don't know many other ways, or maybe any other way, that we can involve Jesus in our day-to-day activities as intimately as through prayer. And that is a theme that we see continuously throughout the Bible, that to be conscious of God offers us an opportunity to pray, that to see where God's working in the world around us is another way of being connected with Him and through prayer. Even just to be sensitive to how we can bless the people around us is an attitude of prayer that seems to be anchored in the life of this community early on in the church. God is able to equip people and journey with those who depend on Him in prayer. That's one point I really want to leave with you today. There is another theme, though, that I want to throw out there as an idea to consider. Going back to Acts 2, where we were reading earlier, we see a little bit of an idea extending from this idea of prayer in the following verses. So I'm just going to read from verses 42 to 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So this is a group of people who were doing a fair few things together. They were studying the Bible, they were singing the same songs, sharing life experiences. They shared seats at each other's tables, welcomed each other into their homes. They made time to listen to each other. And we can't escape this theme of a regularity of deep human connection. That's something that hasn't necessarily been a guaranteed part of the way many people have defined church, especially in the Western world. It's something that hasn't always been my experience when people meet on a Saturday or a Sunday morning and they all sit together, listen to a presentation, and then go have lunch all in their separate homes until the next week. That's become a picture of church that has lost this theme that we see so clearly put out in the book of Acts. Almost as if those couple of hours dedicated together on a Saturday or a Sunday morning will make this happen. Yet here we don't see themes of a loneliness epidemic, which is on all accounts a real challenge in the society we're living in today. And while what this might look like in the modern era does leave a lot of questions. We have busy lives. There are some difficulties how to make this work practically. I think we should still wrestle with the question that's unavoidable of what would it look like to make connection a priority as a community following Jesus. I ask that as a sincere question, knowing that Locus, you guys have already made, I think, some incredible steps in being intentional with that. And I really, really encourage you to continue wrestling with that question because I think it's such an important one. There's another verse I want to share with you that comes from the book of James. It's James 5, verse 13 to 16. It says there, "Is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective." There's a lot of angles we can take on this verse. And there's a few mentions towards healing there that I might put to the side just because of today's theme. But one of them that stands out to me is not just the frequency of connection, but the closeness and intimacy. In the last few years, I've realized that there were some specific settings where this kind of intimacy was deeply uncomfortable for me. And it's something that I still struggle with in a number of ways. I actually found it pretty confronting, in all honesty, and it was particularly around themes of prayer. Maybe because of the kind of upbringing I've had, the people I've been around, praying in front of a group of people, especially on very general topics, I don't usually find it a difficult thing to do and often quite enjoy the opportunity to pray for people in that way. So if you asked me to go to the front of a church building with 1,000 people and pray, it's something that I've become used to. Yet I realized that if I wanted to have an opportunity to pray with someone very close to me, and I'm talking about the one-to-one kind of a prayer, a family member, a very close, even Christian friend, there would be some natural difficulties for me with that. I think one of the reasons is because it's hard to hide behind the generic things that often come up in our prayer. Those types of prayers tend to be the most personal kind. And I don't know whether that's something that's more of a me thing or if it's something that you guys can relate to, but I maybe want to sort of put the question out there. If you have a friend in your life who is also following Jesus, or a family member, whether that's a parent, a sibling, what are the emotions that tend to come up with the thought of praying with them and them alone? And I'm not talking about praying in kind of a forced way where you get put together in the right setting and kind of encouraged to pray. I'm talking about the sorts of prayer that feel like a natural reaction of bringing a situation to Jesus. How natural does it feel to have a friend at church who maybe you've known for years, where you hear the news of a really challenging situation and your desire is to pray with them there and then and bring the difficulty before Jesus? How would the people around you who maybe see it happening make you feel? Is it sort of conceivable to have the types of relationships that are maybe described in this last verse, where we can even pray about the very deep spiritual battles that we all experience? If you're anything like me, those are the sorts of things that are not on the natural path at all. I would say, quite a degree of resistance to them. It takes a level of vulnerability and a shared understanding that this friendship we have, we're going to invite Jesus to be part of it in every aspect of our lives. Yet I can guarantee you that if you, quite unfortunately, made a trip to North Korea in the near future and ended up in a community of believers there, that community of believers would see it as a privilege. They would invite you to have that kind of a prayer with them. The church in Iran, they're doing this stuff all the time. And the early Christian church, as we've already read, seemed to have that kind of a dependence on prayer that didn't stay at a shallow surface. It was an intimate part of their relationships with each other. And I can't get away from this idea that God transforms the relationships of people who are willing to pray together. One of the reasons I think this is a serious question worth wrestling with is because it is so natural to build our relationships as a community, as a church, on things other than Jesus. There are hobbies that we share. We can appreciate each other's humor. We've got intellectual tussles that enrich our walk with God. We can enjoy good food and even make our schedules overlap so that we can be together. But it's not these common hobbies or schedules that will bring about the kind of love of Jesus that is tangible in a community. The kind of descriptions that we read in John before that will be a demonstration to the whole world of what the love of God looks like. It's our oneness in Jesus that will bring the oneness in our relationships with each other. The kind of oneness that's unmatched anywhere else in the world. So if you asked me, what would the church look like if it were to experience life with Jesus? Or what would the church look like if it were illegal? I think two ideas that stand out really loud and clear in the early Christian church is that they were firstly a praying church and also a community deeply connected to each other. I don't think that's actually a full list, and I'm still very much wrestling with what other points might be part of the answer to that question, I really, really encourage you to maybe consider wrestling with that question a little bit more, because I think there's a lot that has been untapped. When I think a bit of the Adventist movement going back 100 years ago, there were a whole lot of truths around how God hopes to connect with humanity that were uncovered, brought to the surface, that really changed the landscape for so many people of who God is. But I think we have a long way to go in the rediscovery of what church might be, what a community following Jesus, particularly in the Western context, what that might live up to. And I hope we can all be part of a journey of maybe rediscovering that as well. I think on a very practical note for today, though, I want to maybe leave you with a challenge or a little opportunity of a step towards a direction of living this kind of a relationship with Jesus as a community. And it's simply this. I think one natural step would be to nurture one relationship, at least one with someone in your spiritual community where you feel comfortable to pray with them personally. And I'm talking about the one-to-one kind of prayer. I know that's a difficult thing. I've already shared some of my challenges with it, but I'm sure that at least some other people here might find some challenges with that. And it can be difficult for a number of reasons. Sometimes it means we need to repair or strengthen a relationship first. Other times we need to actually just make more time for those relationships. We often don't make the time to listen to each other's stories and experiences where these sort of prayers can happen more naturally. You might also find that this brings to the surface fears of rejection, sometimes feeling inadequate praying for people. And I think that's a really cool opportunity to rediscover the gospel in a maybe a way that you haven't experienced before. There are sometimes, I think, a natural reaction where we have a bit of a resistance to being prayed for. And if that's sort of the response you get, I reckon that's a really cool thing to bring to God in prayer as well and to present that to Him. I say this without even the slightest bit of joke, just in case that sort of is a temptation. But there are people who have been on journeys that have been quite damaging and destructive, who sometimes even benefit from professional support through a counselor and a psychologist before they can step into having these kind of relationships. And I think if that's the journey for anyone here, I can only encourage you in that journey, as even though it's a hard one, one very, very well worth taking. I'll make a little shout out to my bros here today as well. I think there's a few unique challenges for many of us in this sort of area of making those deep, meaningful relationships. We've got a culture that encourages at times the very opposite of these sorts of relationships. And if you feel daunted, repulsed, maybe frustrated or indifferent by the kind of theme we're talking about, I just want you to know that's perfectly okay. That's very understandable and quite a natural reaction given the world we live in. I think we have very little control over the sort of pictures of manhood or masculinity that are painted around us. But whatever your reaction is to it, I'd really encourage at least some time with God in prayer on it. The reality is that we have opportunities to make intentional choices, to be shaped by God's picture of who He desires us to be. And without that intentionality, unfortunately, we will tend to passively drift with whatever the culture around us is. Bring this to Him if you feel that's an area of struggle. You may feel that making an effort for these kind of relationships does take a little bit of forced effort to begin with. It takes time to build trust with people, and that's all very, very natural. But I believe the journey of becoming more connected to each other and making Jesus the center point of our relationships, even though it can be a long journey, is something that God promises to meet every need along the way. And sometimes I think he can even use our efforts to be more connected to each other as a way to reveal himself more and more. I can say from my own experience that the relationships I've been able to form, and there aren't many, I'll be honest, that are like this, have been ones that have been priceless. And often the most encouraging during the times of spiritual battles in my life. It's these relationships where people have the ability to speak encouraging words into our lives and remind us of God's love when we struggle to see it. They're the ones where we can be vividly reminded of God's goodness. And so I just want to leave that reminder that God wants you to know his love more and more deeply. He wants to infuse our lives with his presence more and more, and I hope we can all embrace that much more into our homes, into our marriages, into our relationships, and make these places where prayer is a feature, where it's not something we shy away from, but that we invite Jesus to be part of them as well. I want to leave that little thought with you as you guys continue to journey together in following Jesus more and more, not only as individuals, but as a community, and hope it'll be a blessing. Keep wrestling with some of these questions as well. Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam, for that thought-provoking presentation. Just really